that this is in fact a continuation of European wars over the course of the last 200-300 years, except that it's on a much greater scale. And we're going to see that it remains largely a European war in some ways, and yet in other ways it is in fact actually what we might describe as a world war. So we're going to attempt to understand a little bit of that. One of the things that obviously instigates this is what you might describe as nationalist and revolutionary ferment. The case of Russia, which we have looked at in some detail, is an obvious example. And of course, there is the other context here is colonial wars. One illustration of that, which I discussed with you, very briefly, is the Boer War, which was fought between 1898 and 1902. And remember that the Boer War is a war that is going to be fought between the British and the Dutch, or the Boers, in what will eventually become South Africa. At this point, we don't have a South Africa. What we have is the colonies here, the Cape Colony, the Orange Free State, the Transvaal and Natal. And at the end of the war, a couple of years after that, the Union of South Africa will be formed in 1905. This slide over here simply gives you, without giving you the political demarcations, but this portion here is the Cape Colony, the Orange Free State here in orange, the Transvaal and Natal. And Natal was, remember, the British colony where Indian indentured laborers had first come in 1860. All right. There are, of course, a great many other colonial wars as well, but that was simply an illustration of colonial wars. Now, there is an enormous human toll of World War I. We can begin with that. You have 65 million men who are going to be mobilized. 8.5 million soldiers are going to die. You're going to have 21 million soldiers who are going to be wounded, and you have 7.7 million prisoners of war and soldiers who are missing. These numbers are reasonably accurate meaning that it's a ballpark figure, although I think that the number of people who are missing is probably substantially greater. And you have a total of 37 million casualties, so we're talking about in which includes the 8.5 million soldiers who died, but the remaining are civilians, civilians who are going to die in the course of the war. We also have to think, when we're thinking about the human toll, we also have to think about refugees, displaced persons, people who move into exile. I mean, if you think of modern-day Syria, that's an analog there, because if you look at the number of people who have died in the civil war in Syria over the course of the last 6 or 7 decades, we're talking about 500,000 people who've been killed, but there are 7 million Syrians who are now living outside the borders of Syria who have been displaced by the war. And finally, when we're thinking about the human toll, historians generally do not look more widely. Scholars who have looked at World War I and other wars of that kind, they don't look at the people who are left behind. Right? I mean, it's like when you're studying immigration. When you're studying immigration and you're looking at people coming into the United States or Brazil or Canada or Australia, and usually the histories are of people who have left, who have exercised a certain kind of mobility. But what about those who stay behind? Right? And of course, there were a huge number of people who were impacted by the war because they were left behind. They lost, okay, their sons, their husbands, their brothers. And what lives did they have? So I think that when we look at the human toll, we have to consider what the implications might have been for all of those families that really got ruptured. Here's a figure here, and this is an interesting illustration. I mean, one of the reasons I'm showing you this is because it's an interesting illustration of how data can both reveal and obscure certain things. So if you look at this, this is a chart which you can find on the internet. There are many such charts of this kind which show what are the casualties by country. And when they're saying casualties here, they're looking only at soldiers. They're not looking at civilians, right? So Germany and Russia both lost 1.7 million soldiers roughly, followed by France, Austria. And if I gave you this and I said, hey, is there something that's really peculiar or odd or something that stands out? And one of the things that stands out, if you look at it closely, it says Great Britain plus Empire. plus empire, which means that the figures for Great Britain include the figures for all those soldiers who came from countries that were British colonies and that were themselves not free. The most striking illustration of that is India. India lost 56,000 men in the war. And you have to, of course, ask yourself, I mean, if we had the luxury, we would look at this in extraordinary detail. Right? Why are Indians fighting the war at all? How does it involve them? And of course, the reasons why they're fighting the war is because that when Britain went to war, all of its colonies in principle technically are at war with Germany and the Central Powers, right? So the war, World War I, just so that you understand, I mean, we're talking about the Allies, and principally there we are talking about Great Britain, France, and Russia in an alliance against what are called the Central Powers, and the Central Powers included, of course, Germany, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and Turkey, right? That's the basic lineup. Then there are other countries. The US is going to enter into the war much later on, as we're going to see. But this chart here, that's what it's obscuring. It's obscuring the fact that there are countries such as India, which lost 56,000 men, which is a lot more than Belgium. And if you look at the propaganda posters, you still get an enormous number of propaganda posters around Belgium, because Belgium was one of the places where trench warfare was at its most intense, right? And one of the peculiarities of World War I is what is called trench warfare, where you have, so the same person who wrote that book, The Social History of the Machine Gun, from which I'd given you some excerpts, he also wrote a book on trench warfare with extraordinary graphic photographs. Because when we're talking about trench warfare, we're talking about soldiers who basically are living in trenches sometimes for a year or two, for that long a period of time. You know, and it's really a war of attrition, where you've got trenches lined up on both sides along the divide, and soldiers are living there, and they're basically firing shots, if you may put it this way. Right? So when you look at charts of this kind, also try to see what it obscures, not only what it reveals. And this, of course, goes back exactly to the kind of comments I had suggested to you about statistics and the emergence of this trust in numbers, which you begin to see in the 19th century. Now, one of the principal motifs that emerges from the war, and that, of course, is in a sense behind the war, is this idea of sacrifice, the glory of sacrifice. And there are some who think that this is a glorious idea, and there are some like myself who think this is the most bizarre idea, this idea that people are simply cannon fodder waiting to be sacrificed for something called the nation. Right? So here's a letter written by an Englishman. These men, in the noble indignation of a great ideal, face a worse hell than the most ingenious of fanatics ever planned or plotted. Men die scorched like moths in a furnace. I mean, on a single day, you might have 20, 30, 50,000 casualties. Right? Blown to atoms, gassed, tortured. And again, other men step forward to take their places, well knowing what will be their fate. And again, this is, you have to read it with a sense of irony as well, because this is exactly what these Englishmen who are now stepping forward, and these Frenchmen who are stepping forward to be slaughtered like lambs, right? This is exactly what they wrote about Africans in the late 19th century. That you have these Zulus with their spears, they come and they're mowed down by a machine gun. And then what happens? The next layer of Zulus come. They're mowed down by a machine gun. And then a third, and then a fourth. Right? Well, that's exactly what this war really was, except that this was not the Zulus who were being slaughtered here, it's Europeans slaughtering each other. And again, other men step forward to take their places, well knowing what will be their fate. So what moves people to commit such sacrifice? And we could look at the political economy of war. We could look at, well, who joins an army? And we're going to find that, of course, the vast bulk of those who join armies, that is when they are not conscripted, when they are not drafted, right? We're assuming only the case of people who voluntarily step forward. that the vast majority of these come from lower working class families. There's a disproportionate number of people in the United States Army, on any army, who are going to come from the ranks of those who generally are poor working class. Right? And then, of course, there's always a layer of officers who are commissioned. And in the United States, you have West Point for officers who are commissioned, and they generally come from the higher ranks of society. Right? Bodies may die, but the spirit of England grows greater as each new soul speeds upon its way. And if you ask me, there's something extraordinarily perverse about this as well. Because, of course, as I said to you, some people think that this is indeed the most glorious thing, sacrificing yourself for the nation. But what is it that makes people sacrifice themselves for the nation, rather than for an idea, for example? Right? And of course, there may be cases where the idea of the nation itself is an idea that moves people, but it seems to me that this is one of those eternal questions that we have to keep on asking ourselves, because we don't really have a satisfactory answer unless we descend into some form of mystification, that the nation is the idea of the blood. And you have to go back to that essay by Renan and my discussion about the whole idea of a nation and a nation state. Right? And here, look at this photograph. I mean, I could give you a question on an exam. I could give you 3 photographs from 3 different periods and say, well, discuss the evolution of photography and what it tells us about human societies. What is this? These are limbless veterans. It's like almost like a studio shot. You know, couple gets married, beautiful studio shot. Well, here are these limbless veterans at a military hospital in Britain. Right? And they are being displayed in all their glory, so to speak. And there's something, of course, also extremely sad about something like this, because there were millions of such people. Right? Now, so you have to, this is a way to make you reflect on what is it that war demands of people. Right? And the representations of war in civil society, the representations of those who become martyrs, as it were. What makes a person a martyr, right? And if 500 people are killed in a terrorist attack, the next day they're all declared martyrs. Well, what did they do to deserve that martyrdom? Right? And why should we necessarily, even unthinkingly, glorify the idea of martyrdom? And this is, of course, a theological idea. Right? The idea of martyrdom is a theological idea. It goes back to those who martyred themselves for Christ. There are other traditions as well. But not every culture has a conception of martyrdom necessarily. Right? Now, each of these countries that was involved in the war had to, of course, put out what, for the sake of convenience, we can simply describe as propaganda posters. Right? And I'm going to show you a whole series of them in quick succession without being able to discuss each of them in any great detail. But they're not only propaganda posters, because of course they're posters intended to recruit young men into the war. They're intended to touch people in a certain way. They're intended to put forth ideas not simply of sacrifice, but ideas of protection, that men are called forth to do something because this is a way of protecting their women folk and children, for example. You'll see a number of posters of that kind. Right? So various forms of glorification are involved in these. And incidentally, I mean, this is among the other things that artists for hire do. Right? I mean, this also should make us reflect on the different kinds of art, because this is also a form of art. And, you know, and such posters are being released and published by governments all the time. Right? So here's 3 million Belgians are destitute in Belgium, because this is a reference to the fact that, as I said, trench warfare was one of the places where trench warfare was really prevalent was the Low Countries. The Low Countries is Belgium, Luxembourg, and Holland, or Benelux as it's sometimes called. Flanders especially. Flanders is the northern portion. The main city would be Antwerp, one of the main cities. And this was one of the major arenas of the war, and so that's why you have a number of posters which refer to Belgium. This is one, of course, coming out from Great Britain, national service, and again you can see the kind of the idea of heroism, the notion, of course, of the foreigner, defend your island from the grimmest menace that ever threatened it. Think of Brexit, by the way. I mean, this could have been, if I could alter a few words here, and this could be a poster for Brexit, because that's what the British conservatives have been, Britain, great island country, very different from the whole continent. That has been really one of the motive forces behind this impulse to separate themselves from the continent. Defend your island. It doesn't say defend your country here. Defend your island. We're a fortress. Right? And so it evokes all of these sentiments. Who's absent? Is it you? And of course, this is a way of earmarking people who are not sacrificing themselves for the country, who are stepping forth, who are dodging military service. Right? So no respect here, obviously, for something called the conscientious objector. And that's a very complicated history. How have European countries and other countries dealt with the conscientious objector? Right? Sorry, this one is repetition here, missing. So to the Sisters of the Red Cross, right? So this had to do with hospital ships, some of which were also attacked by submarines. And you can later on, I'll make this available to you. You can look at the little poem there. They're coming from all sides, of course. These posters are coming from not just from the Allied forces and from Belgium and Holland and Great Britain. They're also coming from Germany. Here you have a German poster which shows a distraught mother and her starving children around the table. And here you see this image of the man and you can see the woman with the child at the back there. He's towering over her. This idea of protection, which you'll see again in another poster as well. Another German poster which shows a skeleton, holding a sheaf of wheat, looming over buildings at a port. 3 men in the lower right corner. We'd have to do some interpretive work to understand exactly what is going on. But when you see a skeleton here, obviously the idea of death, the idea of, what you might describe as the forces of industrialization, which were critical to the war, right? And this particular poster here, I think, is a dramatic and yet simple illustration of what I've described as a protective arm of the man. The protective arm of the nation, really, right? E.M. Forster, the great English novelist, said that if you want to move men to do things, all you have to do is invoke the phrase women and children. In the defense of women and children, you can get men to do anything, including acts of savagery against others. And this is exactly what's being evoked here in a poster of this kind. This is an American poster. On which side of the window are you? Because here you have soldiers who have been enlisted, and then there's obviously an upper class man who's standing on the other side, suited and booted, probably a Wall Street banker. What else would they do, right? That's the implication of this particular poster here. We'll get to the question of the U.S. and the war in just a moment. Remember, Belgium, buy bonds, fourth liberty loan. So this is actually an American poster, but now this is in support of Belgium and the Low Countries, and this is a poster for war bonds. All right, and of course there was a question: carry on the army's fight against venereal diseases, because whenever you have a war on this scale, even much smaller wars, very often the armies had brothels. Many people think that this is something that only happened, for example, among the Japanese, and what are called the Korean comfort women. But brothels for soldiers were not really uncommon. They may not always be called brothels, but they were not uncommon. And of course, there was the constant fear of the spread of venereal disease. So now the war has to be fought against venereal disease as well, and the spread of venereal disease. And that's what this poster is really about. You had women who were not, of course, at the front, but women who are coming in as volunteers. In this case, this is the YWCA, the Young Women's Christian Association. The other institution, of course, we know is a YMCA. But this, if you look over here, it says back our second line of defense. So this was in support of women who were playing auxiliary roles in the war, right? They're not at the front, but they may be at the supply lines. You see the beginning of that. This is going to become a much greater force when we look at World War II. And this poster, finally, the Women's Land Army of America, which is again a way of trying to suggest that, look, I mean, okay, the United States is not is far away from the theater of war, but in some ways we really have to think about the way in which we defend our nation and the role of women in defending a nation, and this is what is invoked by this particular poster here. Now, we need to look at some other implications of the war as well. I'm not particularly interested in the military history. There are, I mean, literally thousands of books that have been written on the military history of the war. But this particular slide, all it really does, it shows you the front over here and the major battles here. So if you're interested in that aspect of it, you can look at this in much greater detail at your own leisure. Here you have a chart which shows you the casualties at some of the major battles, and you can when I was saying that you could have 20,000 or 30,000 or 40,000 people killed in one single day, that's no exaggeration at all. All you have to do is really you just have to look at the casualties. Of course, some of these wars are fought over several days, sometimes weeks, sometimes months. As well. But here you have the 100 Days Offensive, as it's called, in 1918, which is really the last push. And you can see the Allied forces and the Germans together lose over 2 million, almost 2.5 million people in that last phase. Now, this slide here shows you, I'd spoken to you very briefly. I'd mentioned the Indians who had fought in the war, 56,000 of them who died. So this is, in fact, a photograph of the Rajput Light Infantry, the second, that's the regiment of the British Indian Army, and this is a photograph of them fighting in Flanders during the winter of 1914-1915. This was the first time that most of these Indian soldiers would ever have gone outside India, and many of them wrote letters back. And when you read these letters, you find that, hey, they say that, hey, here we have a certain degree of freedom which we don't have in our own country, because remember, of course, that India is under colonial rule. So there are interesting aspects to those letters of that kind that we can mull over. Now, we need to try to understand some of the major geopolitical and social consequences of the war. One of the things that's going to happen is that the map of Europe is going to be redrawn to some degree. The map of Europe continues to be redrawn. Every major war, World War II, is going to do exactly the same thing over here. So if you look at these countries which are mentioned in red here, these are countries that are carved out of the war, and you can see that the defeated former empires, something I've talked about repeatedly, the fact that one of the consequences of the war was a crumbling of the older empires, including Germany over here, the Ottoman Empire over here in the lower right, and this is what we had discussed in my preceding lecture, what is eventually going to emerge as a creation of these mandates, such as a mandate in Syria and the mandate in Iraq. And then you have here the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which is going to collapse as well, and these new countries are going to emerge: Czechoslovakia, Austria-Hungary, and we know that these borders are going to shift again during World War II, and then they're going to shift again to some degree, right? After the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, new countries are going to emerge once again. But this is what's put in motion by the end of the war. Now, some of this is quite straightforward. We're not going to linger on this for too long, some of it. The defeat of the Central Powers. What were some of the geopolitical consequences of the war? Defeat of the Central Powers, the breakup of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, breakup of the Ottoman Empire. The imposition of the Versailles Treaty again, a massive subject of interrogation for historians, particularly those who have been concerned with what were the circumstances that led to German militarism in the 1920s and 1930s, to the revival of German militarism and the rise of Nazism. And one of the things that's often mentioned is the Versailles Treaty, because the Versailles Treaty, one of the things that it did was it imposed reparations on Germany. So Germany had to pay reparations to the victorious Allied powers. Right? There were also demands for independence from colonies, spurred by their contributions to the war. Here again, India is a good illustration. In 1917, before the end of the war, in late 1917, the British government instituted what were called the Montagu-Chelmsford reforms, right, which lead to what is called the Government of India Act of 1917. All that Britain really did in the Government of India Act of 1917 was to simply say that we're going to try to introduce small measures of autonomy for Indians. And of course, this left the Indians extremely unhappy, considering the human toll of the war among Indians. So what we're going to find at the end of the war is we're going to find that the demands for independence are going to begin to accelerate, not just in India, but in many other colonies. Colonies that had contributed to the war effort, and we could say that one of the consequences of World War I was the instigation of anti-colonial movements. Right? Then you have the emergence of the U.S. on the world stage. Now, the United States, as I'm certain you know from the history that you studied in high school, did not enter the war until 1917. There had been people who had been agitating for U.S. involvement, although I would say that that was a minority, and one of the reasons why that was a minority was that there was a long strand of thinking in the United States, which had to do with American isolationism, that the U.S. doesn't really want to get involved with old Europe. Right? So you have to go back to the Monroe Doctrine to understand that sentiment, that the Western hemisphere of the world is essentially our hemisphere. That's how the Americans were thinking beginning in the early 19th century, and we don't really want to get involved with all the entanglements of old Europe. Right? That was a much stronger force. But by early 1915, particularly because there were American losses, unintended American losses, you might say, and most of these losses had to do with attacks on maritime shipping, right? Because one of the things that happened during the war is that as the war picks up and as Germany gets, if I may put it this way, more desperate, its attack on maritime shipping continued to increase. All right, and you're going to have a luxury liner called the Lusitania, which in 1915 is going to be sunk. Now, this luxury liner has something like about, if I remember correctly, I think it was something like 1,900 passengers on it. About 1,200 of them are going to die, and I think about approximately 130 of the people who died were American citizens. Right? So this is going. In other words, Germany's position is that there is no zone of shipping that is now immune from attack. And this is going to be one of the problems that is eventually going to lead to the American entry into the war in April 1917, at a time when Woodrow Wilson was the president of the country. And what this is going to signify is the end of isolationism. All right, the end of isolationism. That is that America is now going to really begin to emerge as a world power. And one of the ways in which you can see the emergence of the U.S. as a world power is to look at the economic strength of the United States. Right? So in 1929, this is 10 years after the end of the war, the United States accounts for 35% of the world's GDP. Right? Remember which two countries had about 30-35% of the world's GDP in the late 1700s? China and India. And now you have the United States, and when I say equals B plus G plus R, I'm talking about that's equivalent to the GDP of Britain and Germany and Russia put together. right? So the United States is now really moving out of its isolationism and beginning to emerge as a world power. You also have what you might describe as three ideological visions, which are now going to compete on the world scene. One is the liberal democratic view. And you have to put that in question marks, because this democratic liberal view did not include at all, did not contemplate at all the idea of autonomy for the colonies. I mean, Woodrow Wilson may have spoken of self-determination for all the nations, but there was no Western power, none, that was prepared to grant autonomy to any of the colonies at the end of the war. And quite to the contrary, as we have seen in the case of the Middle East, what the Europeans are going to do is they're going to establish mandates there. But you do have this liberal democratic vision, at least in the rhetorical sense. You have an authoritarian, totalitarian, fascist vision that's going to emerge as well. And we're going to see, of course, the acceleration of that in the 20s and 30s, both in Russia, which is going to gravitate towards a totalitarian state under the rule of Stalin, and of course in Germany, where National Socialism is going to get entrenched a couple of decades later. And then the third vision is what I have described as the anti-colonial vision. So there's a League of Nations is going to come into place, and the mandate system is going to be established, as I'd spoken to you before. Now, I also want to look very briefly at something that I mentioned to you on Friday. That is the implications of the Armenian genocide in slightly greater detail. And in order to understand that, let us recall what I mentioned to you first, right? On Friday, namely that when in the 1930s Hitler was asked how he thought he might be able to get away, because he had already put forward a plan which involved the extermination of the Jews. It wasn't spelled out in great detail until later on, but this was already part of the platform. And he invoked the Armenian Genocide, because he said, well, who even remembers Armenia? So the implication was that, well, who's going to remember this one, right? And this is what I mean by a forgotten genocide. And you could say, by the way, that there are a great many other genocides as well. I mean, if I, for example, mention to you that in 1971, nearly 1 million people in East Pakistan were killed by the West Pakistani army, I mean, I doubt that there are more than 10 people on this campus who are aware of that fact. That's a forgotten genocide. 1 million people who were killed in 6 to 8 months, literally. Right? And I don't think it is, by the way, sufficient for us to simply say, oh, never forget, never forget. Because if you look at the Holocaust, I mean, there are still people who, in fact, actually deny that the Holocaust ever took place. Right? So, in other words, I mean, what this calls forth when we think about the Armenian genocide or any other genocide is that we really have to think both about the human capacity, which is really quite extraordinary and bizarre in some respects for evil, but we also have to think about how we're going to consider the force of memory in human societies, right? Why is it that we choose to remember some things and choose to forget some things? And what do these acts of forgetting signify? And are there acts of forgetting that might actually be critically important, by the way, for the creation of a healthy society? There may be others which are to the contrary, but we may not want to see this in a single register. By this I mean simply that if you look at the rise of nationalism nearly all over the world today, what you find that much of this is predicated on the idea of remembering the real or imagined grievances of a people. All right? I mean, for example, the Hindu right wing in India has been arguing that the Holocaust in Germany was relatively trivial compared to the 100 million Hindus they claim were killed by Muslims over a course of 6-7 centuries in India. That's their claim. Right? So it's the invocation of that past. And what I'm saying, there's a complicated politics to the invocation of that past. But let's go back to the Armenian genocide. So you have 1.5 million people who are killed. Many of the people who are killed constitute part of a Christian minority. And there may be something puzzling for those of you who are thinking through what I'm saying about this genocide, because you may be recalling my comments to you about the Ottoman Empire and about the fact that the Ottoman Empire was, comparatively speaking, quite tolerant. But what's happening to the Ottoman Empire? That from the mid-19th century onwards, it is starting to disintegrate. It's starting to disintegrate. You've got the Greek Wars of Independence, you've got the Crimean War, right? It's starting to disintegrate. But the disintegration has to be understood not simply as a physical disintegration. It is also the pressure of the idea of the nation state imposing itself upon the Ottoman Empire. Because we have to say that this empire, which tolerated all of these minorities, now is no longer able to do so. And as I pointed out to you, Britain and France and the European powers had something to do with that as well. But you do see the pressures of nationalism there. So, you have what is called the Young Turk movement, which is eventually, of course, the rise of Ataturk and the creation of a new Turkish state, right, in 1908. And this intolerance is going to be reflected in the persecution of the Armenians, who are also seen by the Turks as a kind of a fifth column, particularly during the war, that they're the people who are going to be held responsible in some respects for the defeat of Turkey. Right? But I want to argue something else as well, which is what I think makes the Armenian genocide a test case. By the way, that the person who coins the word, which then becomes enshrined in international law, Ralph Lemkin, in 1943, he's the one who drafted what is going to become the international set of conventions having to do with genocide, that his main inspiration here for thinking about this was the Armenian genocide. But I want to suggest to you that if you look at the Armenian genocide, and then if you look at the Holocaust in the late 1930s and through the mid-1940s until the end of World War II, you find that both of these groups of people are people who are in many ways exceedingly cosmopolitan. They're also diasporic populations. Some people think that, in fact, the Armenians became diasporic after the genocide. That's not the case at all. There's been an Armenian genocide, an Armenian diaspora for centuries. For example, the Armenians had a very long and interesting presence in India. If you go to Calcutta, you go to Madras, there's an Armenian town, right? So people who are diasporic and cosmopolitan in some ways are more vulnerable, I'm trying to suggest to you. And this is what you really see in the case of the Armenian genocide. And of course, the other two interesting things which I want to draw your attention to is that what happens here is that genocide is now moving closer to Europe. You remember that if you look at the Americas, and you look at the extermination of the American Indians, what you're talking about is people who were considered to be, from the European standpoint, savage or primitive, right? And then what you get is, in the case of Armenia, you're talking about people whose proximity to Europe is much greater than the people who are living in the Americas or in Africa. And then, of course, by the 1930s, 1940s, this genocide has moved to the heart of Europe. Right, something we're going to investigate when we look at the idea of the Holocaust. And finally, my last comment on this, that genocide very often is given a cover by war, by which I mean very simply this, that when you have a war, and remember that this genocide is taking place within the context of World War I, right? It commences in 1915, April 1915, goes on for several years, that under the pretext of war, states will very often try to eliminate those people who they feel constitute either traitors or a fifth column or people who do not fit the idea of the nation state. And you find that in rebellions too, by the way. You find that in everyday rebellions. When you see, for example, a rebellion on the streets of America, do not imagine for a moment that everyone who's taking part in that rebellion is inspired by political sentiments. Some people are simply going to take advantage of that to create mayhem, to get into breaking up stores and lifting goods from these stores, right? That is that these rebellions can furnish a cover for what you might call everyday crimes. They can sometimes. And similarly, war furnishes a cover for genocide. And that's, of course, exactly, by the way, what the Turkish government has been claiming, that the Turkish government, as I pointed out, denies to the present day that there was ever any genocide. And they do admit that there were Armenians who were killed, but they say that this was a consequence of the war. So these are some of the ways in which I think you might want to think about it. Now, a couple of other considerations. One of them has to do with the emergence of women. This is actually a demonstration of women in Egypt in 1918. But I want to very briefly think about some of the implications of the war for women. And I think that in order to do so, we need to think about men at war and men at sex, if I may put it this way. What do I mean by that? I want to take you back for a moment to the Peloponnesian War, which was fought between Athens and its allies and Sparta and its allies. This great war was, of course, the subject of that enormously interesting and influential book by Thucydides, The History of the Peloponnesian War, right? Nearly 2,500 years old. Now, there is a Greek writer at that time. There may be a few of you who have read his comedy, Lysistrata, right? So I'm talking about Aristophanes, and he sets this play in Athens. And what is the context for the play? The context, very simply, is the women are just completely fed up with the men, because the men are constantly at war. And incidentally, he set his play at a time when Athens had suffered this crushing loss during what is called the Sicilian expedition. Right? So what do the women decide? They decide that they are going to ensure that they are not available for sex to their husbands at all. So they go on a sex strike. Right? Now, I think that this is useful for understanding a number of things. I mean, you can simply read it as a comedy, but in fact, I mean, I think that this problem remains a fundamental problem down to the present day, that men are constantly at war, right? So it's useful because we have to think about World War I as also the occasion when women begin to emerge in the public sphere, which includes, incidentally, the sexual autonomy of women, all right? They're also managing the home front. You remember the figures I gave you of how many men are mobilized? Well, that many men are mobilized. There are going to be a great many families which are now going to be managed by women. They're managing the home front. And one of the implications of that is they begin to enter into the workforce. What we're also going to see is that when the war ends, many of these women who had entered into the public sphere and who now begin to get into industry, for example, many of these women are going to be pushed back into domesticity. Then the men return, they're going to once again say that, well, you have to move back into the domestic sphere. But nevertheless, it was an opening for many of these women. Right? And I don't think it is an accident at all that it is in the years just preceding the war, during the war, and after the war, that in most countries, especially in Europe, that women acquire the right to vote. So, for example, in Australia, they acquire the right in 1902, in Norway in 1913, Denmark 1915, Russia, the February Revolution, the Petrograd Revolution, not the Bolshevik Revolution. They get universal suffrage in 1917. In Britain, Germany, and Poland, they get it in 1918. And I'm not giving you the complete list here. And they get the right to vote, the 19th Amendment to the US Constitution, in 1920. Right? So I think that this is, in fact, one of the major implications of the war, is how it alters, at least in principle, relations between men and women, the autonomy that women are going to begin to feel, and obviously that autonomy is translated into the vote in the first place, but it is also an autonomy for a woman to become, if I may put it this way, a modern woman. all right? And in order to understand that, we're going to have to look later on at the rise of women's movements in the 20th century. All right, what were the socioeconomic and cultural consequences of the Great War? This is a war that is billed as a global war. And as I've suggested to you, that this view has to be both qualified and endorsed at the same time. It has to be qualified because in many respects it was a continuation of the kind of wars that had been taking place in Europe, wars over the balance of power in Europe. On the other hand, you have colonial empires that have contributed a great deal, and of course the United States enters into the war as well. But it is also global in many other ways, because we would have to look at industrial production, we would have to look at the ammunitions industry, we would have to look at the massive increase in the production of tanks, aircraft, submarines, ships, and small arms, all right? It ushers in an idea of economic modernity, an idea of mass production and mass consumption. What is now called the assembly line is created in the early 1920s. And the best illustration of that, of course, is the Ford Model T. And if you see there, I've written 10 seconds, you're wondering what that is. What that refers to is the fact that by 1925, there was one Model T that was coming off the assembly line every 10 seconds. Every 10 seconds. In 1925, in a single day, they were able to produce 10,000 cars, or 2 million cars annually. And in 1925, half of the world's cars were produced by the Ford Motor Corporation in 1925. Half, all right? Right? But this is all being instigated by, it's a consequence, you might say, an implication of the war, because one of the things the war did was it created this idea of the assembly line. Of course, particularly with respect to producing tanks, small arms, and so on. The threshold for war and violence is also increased. You have mechanized slaughter, the idea of sacrifice, which I've discussed for you, and the beginnings of aerial bombing, bombing civilian areas by aircraft. You have the emergence